What you doing back there? Yeah? So, do you want to show them your puzzle box? You want to solve your puzzle box? So this thing has multiple screws and whatnot, and in it are several almonds. No.
Brevity is the soul of wit. Not our wit, though, because Hoid is an absolute windbag. Indeed, every single Stormlight Archive book ends with a monologue from our blustery friend, and Rhythm of War is no different. We find him in Elhakar's old palace on the Shattered Plains, bloviating to his cryptic about the nature of sleight of hand tricks and waiting for his old friend Odium to show up. And Odium does indeed show up. At least, a version of him does, but it's not the Odium Hoid was expecting, and he quickly begins to suspect something is very, very wrong. But before anything can be done to protect himself, something happens to his memories. Somehow, they've been swept away like a backdrop pulled from the stage, quickly, quietly, and operated by an unknown presence. And then, we see Hoid start his conversation with Odium over, completely unaware that he's already had it. Or is he? For this performance, we'll be looking at the same scene through the eyes of various characters, examining and re-examining it to see if we can determine what exactly happened that day in Elhakar's palace. All of this and more awaits you on the other side of the curtain, but you have been warned. Major Rhythm of War spoilers will be there as well. Now is your last opportunity to turn back and watch something less riddled with spoilers. Might I recommend 10 characters to watch in Rhythm of War? For those of you still in your seats, I invite you to sit back, relax, and allow our performance to take your breath away. Rhythm of War's epilogue, entitled Dirty Tricks, begins with Hoid searching for an audience, in more ways than one. He wanders through Elhakar's palace, searching for someone to admire his sleight of hand tricks, all while awaiting an audience with Odium. He remarks to his cryptic sidekick, named Design, about how his illusions without light weaving are superior, but gives no explanation as to why when pressed. Indeed, he sighs and tells Design to go bother someone else for a while, which is delightfully obliged him. As Design scampers off with a few corrupted Windspren in tow, Odium arrives in the palace and finds Hoid in Elhakar's old sitting room. They speak for a while, and everything seems to be going according to Hoid's plan. Until Odium slips out of character when he asks whom Hoid would pick as champion. This gives Hoid pause, and Odium quickly realizes that he's screwed up, so he resorts to Plan B. Odium remarks that he cannot hurt Sephandrius, but he can do something with the memories our friend carries with him in the form of investiture, Nalthian breaths. Right as Odium determines he can do something with these memories, the paragraph cuts out, and we find Hoid walking down the hallways of the palace again. Basically, Odium messed up his lines and he needs the performance restarted from the top of the scene. Hoid begins his monologue from the beginning, noting that it's odd Design and the Windspren are not where he expects them to be, and waits for Odium to arrive. They have the same conversation again, but Odium's dialogue is slightly modified to subvert suspicion. Hoid slams the door and leaves, remarking that the conversation went exactly as he had planned it, and the book ends. So, what exactly happened here? On the surface, it would appear that Odium stole Hoid's memories and tricked him into believing he came out on top. And while I think this assessment is partially accurate, this epilogue is riddled with implications and schemes that are not immediately apparent. We're going to need to pull this apart and examine every angle with a fine-tooth comb before we can draw any definitive conclusions. Let's start off by looking at the part Odium plays in this and see what we can glean from his actions. In my last video, we talked about the big picture implications of Odium's new vessel and what that might mean for the Cosmere as a whole. But we didn't really get into the actual nitty-gritty of what Odium might be able to do now and how he might act. However, this epilogue is a perfect example of what Todd might be capable of considering his new vessel. And if you're wondering who Todd is, maybe go check that last video. First and foremost, Odium is able to tamper with Hoid's breaths, a form of investiture native to Nalthis that can apparently store memories. So in this episode we have a first for Cosmere Connections. Earlier in the day, right before I recorded this episode actually, Brandon went ahead and confirmed that Hoid's breaths were destroyed by Odium, but Odium was not able to access the memories contained within. Man, it's nice getting new information. All this being said, Hoid has pointedly lost his perfect pitch at the end of the epilogue, which indicates what was confirmed by Brandon. He does have fewer breaths than he started with. It is also implied by Todd that Odium was unable to tamper with Hoid's investiture previously, but he is now able to, implying that some sort of deal between Reyes and Hoid was struck at one point but is now moot. Sanderson intentionally leaves us in the dark about what sort of deals are now null and, pardon the pun, void, but it is clear that at least some agreements made with the previous Odium can be disregarded. I would assume that this also includes Taravangian's personal deal with Odium in which only Karbranth's population is spared, but this is suspiciously never brought up. And while that particular deal is outside the scope of this video, I think we can proceed with a cautious knowledge that Todd has the power to nullify some contracts made with his predecessor. There's one last thing I'd like to bring up before we move on, and that is Taravangian's planning and how it relates to Hoid. It is very specifically remarked that Taravangian never saw him in his planning, which carries with it a pretty big implication. That the diagram was made without knowledge of Hoid, both as a world hopper and as a being with an incredibly long life. This probably screwed up the diagram in some profound ways, but with Hoid accounted for, it can now be amended. Where the diagram goes from here is anyone's guess, but I will go ahead and assume Todd will use it to its full extent. Its followers, its radiance, and even a herald at his disposal. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all looks pretty bad for Roshar, and specifically bad for Hoid, but there are a few things that pad this impact, however gently. Let's take a moment to look at this epilogue from Hoid's perspective and see if we can deduce anything from his actions. So, yeah, things are looking pretty bleak for our blustery friend at this point, but I think he's still got a few tricks up his sleeve. For instance, this epilogue is literally called Dirty Tricks. It opens with Hoid ruminating on trickery and even performing sleight of hand tricks for a few spren, making it very clear to his cryptic that he prefers trickery that does not utilize investiture. Metatextually, this is Sanderson telling the reader to look closer. There are tricks being played on his own audience. Indeed, any trickery being played here is far more subtle than any form of investiture. I think we can safely assume that Hoid would never reveal himself to Odium just to make a few puns at him, regardless of how much he would like to do so. This puts him in far more danger than it is worth and only serves to hurt his own purposes. What is he doing here then? While I don't think it'll be apparent until the next book what his goals in this epilogue were, I think we can assume that he is there to mislead Odium in some way, shape, or form. This plan obviously goes awry when it is revealed that Odium is not Reyes anymore, but there are some clues left over from the first interaction that will give Hoid a solid idea that something is not as it seems. First off, His cryptic and the windspren following it disappear seemingly out of nowhere to Hoid. Secondly, the coins that he was using to perform his sleight of hand tricks appear in random places on the ground. Thirdly, while speaking with Todd the second time, he feels that something is off. Any of these taken alone might lead Hoid to suspect something weird is happening, but taken together, almost certainly guarantees that something happened. And then there's the final piece of evidence. While walking away, Hoid notices that his perfect pitch is off, implying that at least a few breaths were lost. Taken all together, I don't think it'll be very hard for Hoid to figure out that something fishy happened here. He will absolutely figure out sooner rather than later that he came out of that palace with fewer breaths than he started with, and use the other bits of information to figure out something went wrong. Now, let's take a look at that coin Hoid is using. Design very deliberately points out at one point that if Hoid really wanted to perform the trick correctly on the planet, he should use spheres, not coins. The only planet we've seen coins used on so far is Scadrial, a planet where, with a little bit of investiture trickery, coins can be used to back up memories. Indeed, the last scene of Bands of Mourning features a coin being used to store memories. Hoid could have been using the coin for his tricks to store memories Odium wouldn't have known about, rendering the breath stealing relatively moot. Before I move on to conclusions, there are two more things at the very end of the chapter I'd like to bring up. First off, Hoid thinks to himself, "This is working," as he walks away from his audience with Odium. Wait, what? What is working? And finally, on the last line of the book, Hoid thinks to himself that this meeting had gone exactly as he imagined, which is a phrase he had used pre-memory erasing to describe a markedly different conversation. Now, there is a lot to look over here, and it is hard to draw any immediate conclusions by the end of this book. But I think if we put this all back together and combine it with everything we previously discussed about Odium, we will have a much clearer picture as to what actually went down in that old palace on the Shattered Plains. So, we've gone through the process of pulling apart this beast of an epilogue, and now we have the task of mashing all the clues together like some sort of video essay bondsmith. A wordsmith, if you will. Though this is by no means definitive, this is the unified theory I've come up with regarding the fourth Stormlight epilogue. Hoid decided to meet with Odium to trick him into revealing some information, but did not anticipate Odium's change in management. After Odium slips up and reveals himself, he steals and destroys some breaths from Hoid, as well as the knowledge that the Shard has a new vessel. While this does prevent Hoid from retaining the knowledge of Odium's switcheroo, he still ends up gaining some useful information from Odium, whatever it was that he set out to gain to begin with. He also got a few good insults in. Go Hoid. After the epilogue ends, Hoid will quickly realize that some of his breaths are missing, and will possibly even be able to retrieve his memories from some sort of coin backup. He will likely continue to be unaware of who Odium now is, but know that something strange happened that day. This will scare the storms out of him, and he will convince the main characters that something is very, very off with Odium, thereby narrowly preventing a disaster and stalling Odium's escape from Braze, at least for now. But this will not keep Odium at bay forever, and a more permanent solution will have to be found for him by the end of the Stormlight Archive series. And so we close out the last episode of Cosmere Connections for the year. I'd like to remind you all that I have a poll up to determine my priority for the next few episodes, so don't hesitate to pick your favorite idea or leave a comment about what you'd like to see in the future. You hold the fate of this channel within your very grasp. I'll be releasing my next Cosmere Connections episode sometime in January, and will be providing Community tab updates on the next few episodes as they progress. So, stay tuned. Storms, I've had fun rambling about this all with you, and hopefully you've had even half that fun watching. I'd kindly remind you to like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter for some quality creme posting as well as general updates. Have a good day, folks.